Dr. Aubrey de Grey is a biomedical gerontologist based in Mountain View, California. He is the Chief Science Officer of SENS Research Foundation, a California-based biomedical research charity that performs and funds laboratory research dedicated to combating the aging process. He's also the VP of New Technology Discovery at AgeX Therapeutics, a biotechnology startup developing new therapies in the field of biomedical gerontology. Thanks. Soon to be revealed.
Seems like a cue. All right.
Okay, yeah.
All right, thanks for that, and thank you all for coming. So yes, I'm delighted to be here. This is the first time for, I'm going to say, 5 or 6 years that I have spoken at an EA event, and I am, very impressed at how rapidly and how far the EA movement has grown over those years. I've been here all day, and I've seen a bunch of the talks, starting with, of course, Will McCaskill in the morning. And I'm very happy to be here. And I note that this timer is not changing, which means, oh, here we go. It's changing. All right, great. So I know that quite a few people in this movement are pretty familiar with the work that I and my group do. And so, I'll bear that in mind. But equally, I know that a lot of you are not familiar, so I won't be assuming too much. And I'm going to, excuse me. I'm going to do my best to limit myself to about 20 minutes so that there's time for questions. In particular, what I'm going to try and do today is to give you guys a sense of why it makes sense to me anyway, that this should be a priority for effective altruists. The idea that we should actually bring aging under control. And I understand that there are a number of questions that all need to be answered in the affirmative in order to make that case. The first one is aging a really big problem? Now, I believe that aging is, by a good distance, the world's biggest problem. But I understand that for a group like this that think very carefully about such stuff, that this needs to be actually justified. The second question is that funny? Okay. All right. The second thing I need to need to argue, is that we have a sufficient understanding today of what aging is and generally how we might go about addressing it, that money thrown at that problem has a good chance of having a significant impact. And this is not trivial. In fact, the last time that I spoke, in fact, all the other times that I've spoken at EA events, I've had a bunch of pushback from that. A bunch of, the view that we understand aging so little that essentially what we do is random, and therefore it is, not obviously justified that this would have a good bang for the buck. And the third thing I need to argue today is something that is very new, has really only arisen over the past few years, which is that philanthropy may have become less important in this particular mission because private money, investment money, has exploded and has become really important. So I'm going to be addressing all of those things. All right. In order to address the first thing, why aging is important, why aging is really, really important as a goal, I don't actually have any slides. I'm just going to... Is that funny? All right. I'm just going to tell you why I think it's clear that this is true. It's just a fact, it's just to me, that the extent of aging causes far more suffering than anything else in the world today, or in the foreseeable future. And it's not just the death part. I mean, we're talking about effective altruism here, right? And that means altruism. It means worrying about other people. Now, people dying makes other people unhappy. That's kind of like, it's like not arguable, really. But also, I mean, perhaps what's much more important is that when people die of aging, they do it slowly. They do it as a consequence of a chronic, progressive accumulation of damage in the body, accumulation of decline in mental and physical function. That's a lot of suffering, too. It's a lot of suffering on the part of the people who are actually doing the aging. And also, it's a huge amount of suffering on the part of the loved ones of the people who are doing the aging. So, to me, it's just like you can't add it up in any other way. Aging is the source of, by far, the largest amount of suffering in the world today. In fact, you could argue that it was true even a long time ago. Now, another thing that I want to emphasize is that this is not only about the industrialized world. Something that is often overlooked is that the rest of the world, the developing world, is catching up in terms of longevity and therefore in terms of how much they experience the health problems of late life. In the most recent statistics that were brought out from the WHO, there wasn't a single country in the world that had a life expectancy, an average lifespan, lower than 50. Outside of sub-Saharan Africa, there wasn't a single country that had one lower than 60. So we can see that the issue of aging is not just a first world problem. It really is an absolutely fundamental problem for the entire world. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about the first question, the question of why aging is a really important issue. Now I'm going to get on to the second question, the question of whether we actually understand aging well enough that the money we throw at it is going to have a significant chance of having an impact. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to go through a bunch of background. First, I'm going to start with this question. Why is it that aging is a problem at all? Why is it that aging has resisted the medical initiatives, the medical knowledge, the medical advances that have been so successful against most infectious diseases? You know, over the past 200 years, we've brought infant mortality down from something like 40%, which is how it was 200 years ago, even in the wealthiest countries in the world, down to nearly zero in those countries. And we did it by ridiculously simple measures, like, you know, figuring out that hygiene is a good idea and, you know, really easy medicines. So what is the problem? Well, most people would say it's this. Don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to read this slide. It's just that, you know, there's so much that goes wrong with us late in life, and it goes wrong at more or less the same time, so these things interact with each other. You know, it's just the complexity, right? Most people think that that's the fundamental answer, and it's part of the answer for sure, but it's by no means the whole answer. So in order to explain the whole answer, I need to define aging, which is crazy, right? I mean, how on earth could we have not yet achieved a good understanding of, you know, the thing that has preoccupied humanity since the dawn of civilization? But it turns out, yes, if you ask people what aging is, you will not get the same answer from everybody. So I'm going to use this very simple definition of aging. Aging is the combination of two processes. A process that goes on throughout life, starting before we're born even, which is where the network of processes that keep us alive, that's what metabolism means, generates damage. And then the reason why damage is the right word to be using for these various changes to the molecular and cellular structure of the body that are brought about by metabolism, the reason why it's the right word is because the body is only set up to tolerate a certain amount of that change. And then after that, the body starts to function less well, both mentally and physically. And that is, of course, the right-hand process, the late life emergence and progression of the pathologies of aging. So at the moment, the overwhelming majority of money that's spent and effort that's spent on preventing the pathologies of late life is spent wrongly. It is spent on trying to slow down, trying to break the link between damage and pathology. And that is so obviously fucked up that I have no idea. You know, I mean, it's just insanely stupid. You can see it immediately because, just look at it. Damage, by definition, is accumulating, which means that the efforts to stop damage from causing pathology are bound to become progressively less effective as the person gets older. I mean, it's just completely obvious. So the next question we have to ask ourselves is, why has humanity been so wedded to this insanely quixotic approach? And one might say, well, okay, maybe there are no alternatives. We'll see shortly that that's not true. But another answer is simply, we have misdefined aging. And that is indeed the case. This is what most people would say if you ask them for a taxonomy of sickness. If you ask them, in what ways can people be sick? They'll say, well, okay, there's column one, that's communicable, infectious diseases. Then there's genetic diseases that a few people get. Then there's the big one, the chronic progressive diseases of late life, like Alzheimer's and almost all cancers and so on. And then most people would say that way out in the stratosphere, there's this completely different phenomenon called aging itself, which consists of these rather poorly defined phenomena like frailty. And the perception is that aging is so different from diseases that it's essentially off limits to medicine, which is kind of like a bit of a shame that we would think that, really. Now, the correct view of the taxonomy of sickness is what I'm showing here, which is exactly the same as the previous slide in terms of the columns. The only difference is where the black line is. And that is key for two reasons. First of all, it's key for a reason I've already told you, namely that the things in column 3 are completely unlike the things in column 1. There is no way that we would expect to be able to address the things in column 3 by the same kinds of medicine as the things in column 1. But the biggest thing that we're seeing here is that there is no difference between column 3 and column 4. In other words, it's just semantic. The things in column 3 are just the aspects of aging that we've chosen to give disease-like names to. And that's a really important thing to take into account. What it does is it helps us to see that we should be adopting a different approach, a more preventative approach to the elimination of pathologies in late life. Now, this is an idea that is not in any way original with me. More than 100 years ago, people started thinking this way, and they invented gerontology, which essentially is inspired by the observation that in nature we see a very big variation in the rates of aging across different species. Even within a species, we see differences in individuals. So the idea was, maybe if we can study that variation really hard, then we maybe understand it well enough that we can actually somehow figure out a way to clean up, to make our metabolism run more cleanly, so that it generates damage more slowly, which would be great, because of course it would postpone the point at which the damage reaches a level that is bad for us, that causes pathologies. But there's a bit of a problem with that. Here it is. Some of you may have written software in the past, and you may understand that this is the ultimate catastrophe of uncommented spaghetti code, right? There is no way in God's earth that we're ever going to be able to manipulate this crazy network of processes that keep us alive in such a way as to stop it from doing the thing we don't want it to do, the creation of damage, without, at the same time, stopping it from doing things we need it to do to keep us alive. Not going to happen. And of course, this is understating the problem, because this only talks about the stuff that we understand about metabolism. Really, what matters is the stuff that we don't know about how the body actually works, let alone the stuff that we don't even know that we don't know. So, crazy. But luckily, there's a completely different approach, which is, remember, what we need to do here is separate metabolism from pathology. We want to carry on being alive without having this side effect of getting sick late in life. Now, I've shown you that we can describe that link between metabolism and pathology as being divided into these two processes. And I've also shown you that we can't break the link between metabolism and pathology by breaking either of those two component processes. But what we might be able to do instead is to separate the component processes from each other. And that's what the maintenance approach is, damage repair. It says let's periodically go in and repair some of the damage that metabolism is generating, so that even though it's continuing to generate it, the damage does not get to a sufficient level of abundance to be bad for us. And I think it is reasonable to call it the common sense alternative, because the fact is, we already observe that it works. This is a simple machine, a car, that is more than 100 years old, and it did not get that way by being designed to last 100 years. It got that way by being designed to last maybe 10 years, but then by being owned by people who fell in love with it and did comprehensive, periodic, preventative maintenance. It just works. So, in other words, aging is not a mystery. It just isn't a mystery. We already understand aging well enough. It's simply the same thing as it is in a car. It's not some kind of emergent phenomenon like consciousness. And comprehensive preventative maintenance, therefore, already is seen to work. The body is, of course, a lot more complicated, but how much more complicated? It turns out not very much. We can actually describe the damage of aging, and I did this 17 years ago, in only 7 words, 7 types of damage, which are listed on the left-hand side of this table. And what's most important is the right-hand side, of course, the fact that for each of these types of damage, we can describe a generic therapy that actually could potentially be the maintenance approach, be the way to repair this type of damage. Within each category, there are maybe many examples of damage, different types, subtly different types of damage in different tissues, but they can still be addressed by only slightly different versions of the same therapy, which means that we can develop those versions pretty quickly. And I don't have time to go into that in any more detail right now, but I'm perfectly happy to do so. However, one thing I really want to emphasize is it's not just me saying this anymore. 5, 10 years ago, this was an argument that really still needed to be made. But now it has been made. So I'm just showing you here, just by illustration, a paper that came out only 6 years ago. It's going to be by far the most highly cited paper in the whole of the biology of aging this decade. And it's simply a root and branch restatement of what I said more than a decade earlier. I mean, I don't care about the credit aspect. I get plenty of credit. That's fine. The fact is, this is now a completely mainstream, orthodox idea, a divide and conquer damage repair approach. So now, the relevance of longevity is something that's worth talking about, because if you look me up in the media, you will see that I get described as things like the prophet of immortality and so on. And it's a bit of it's a bit irritating, really, because the fact is we don't work on longevity. We really don't, let alone immortality. Longevity is a side effect of health. And yes, I mentioned at the beginning that when people die, it makes people sad. But the fact is, I think that the suffering before death is more important. The fact is there's an awful lot of it, and that makes people pretty sad too, including the people who are actually experiencing it. So, to me, we're just doing medicine. Yes, there is this side effect that if we do medicine really well for the elderly, then on average, people are likely to live a lot longer. And yes, I think that's a good thing, but it's still a side effect. So don't be seduced by what the media constantly harp on about with regard to that. And then, of course, what I'm really meaning here is that the media harp on about it because of the ease with which it is possible to make a case against doing something about aging if you only think about longevity. Excuse me. People will say things like this, they'll say, oh dear, where will we put all the people? Or they'll say, like, won't it only be for the rich? Or won't dictators live forever? Now, the fact is, these are very, very, very easy concerns to rebut. Dictator, I mean, come on. Last I heard, dictator was fairly high on the league table of risky jobs. Not a lot of dictators die of aging in the first place. And the ones that do, obviously, organize their succession beforehand, so it's functional immortality. And boredom, would you prefer to get Alzheimer's at the age of 80 or to be bored at the age of 150? I mean, hands up anyone who chooses, right? So, this is easy, right? Even overpopulation, this is a meaningful concern, but the fact is, we know that the overpopulation problem we have today that's causing climate change and so on is going to go away because we've already got renewable energy that's actually now cheaper than fossil fuels. As of literally last week, the UK, where I originally come from, was for the first time since the Industrial Revolution making more electricity from renewables than from fossil fuels. And that obviously is something that we all know is going to continue. And of course we can go into artificial meat and so on. and desalination, all the other technologies that are going to be raising the carrying capacity of the planet far faster than the population could conceivably increase, even if we completely eliminated all death. So these things are easy to answer. And, if we just focus on the fact that people do not actually like being sick, and we focus on the fact that even if some of these problems did actually arise as a consequence of solving the problem of aging that we have today, there is no way to argue that those problems would be worse than the problem we have today. So now, I want to finish, and I've officially only got 38 seconds, but I'm going to use a little longer. I'm going to finish by the question of feasibility. Because the fact is, it's very, very important for effective altruists to understand that their money is being spent well, is actually making a difference. And that's important to me, too, in terms of how I use my time. So the issue in this regard used to be, let's say 10 years ago, that it was unclear whether we knew enough about aging to know what to be putting money into. And I hope I've been able to convince you over the past little while that that's no longer true. That the progress that's been made over the past while has been substantial, has been quite enough to show that we really can actually be sure that we're going in the right direction. I've got here a small list, a small subset of the publications that we've put out at SENS Research Foundation over the past few years. These are real breakthroughs published in very high-profile journals. But more than that, we've been able to convince investors. So we've been able to actually spin things out into startup companies that are pursuing this with, of course, the benefit of considerably more money than what was available when it was only philanthropic. And in addition to the companies that we've spun out, there are huge numbers of companies that are coming into existence who are aligned with us doing other types of damage repair. As you can see here, I need to update this slide literally every month in order to keep it up to date, and I've given up. One example, a local company named Unity Biotechnology has really been a poster child of this because they were able to raise a year or so ago the kind of money that a biotech company would normally raise when they were in phase 3, when they were almost already approved for actually having a product that could make money. And they got this before they had begun their first clinical trial. So this is pretty damn good news. But look at the bottom of this slide. Unity actually announced a phase 1 result last week. And it was a really good result. Phase 1, as most of you know, is all about safety. But if you're doing well, you look for efficacy as well. And they got really good efficacy. And what happened? They actually had a 20% decline in their share price. Now, that's the problem with the private sector. The private sector revolves around people trying to make money, irrespective of how they make the money. That's the whole thing about short selling and so on. So I say that this actually is a great demonstration of why we still need philanthropy. SENS Research Foundation views itself these days as the engine room of the industry. We work on early-stage projects for as long as it takes to get them to the point of sufficient proof of concept that we can spin them out into startup companies. And we're not the only ones. LRI, that's the Longevity Research Institute. This is a new organization also in the Bay Area that's working in a rather more narrowly defined space right now, looking at reproducibility of results, but they may grow. And of course, there are going to be other organizations like this. Philanthropy matters enormously in this. We believe that we can get all, or at least almost all, of the really key technologies in rejuvenation biotechnology out into clinical trials within a couple of years from now. And we first started saying 2021 about 3 years ago, and that has not slipped. So that's pretty good news in the first place. But the key point here is that the things that are being funded effectively by the private sector, by investors right now, are the lower hanging fruit. And damage repair is inherently a divide and conquer concept. You can't only hit the lower hanging fruit. You've got to hit all the components. So it becomes even more important than ever to actually get the most difficult things further forward. And that is still a goal for philanthropy. As some of you know, I wrote this book some time ago. Please read it if you want to know more about the biology, and I will stop there and take questions.
When it comes to impactful careers for bioscientists, how would you rate aging versus pandemic prevention?
Tricky, because pandemic prevention is certainly a huge area. But the question has to be, are there already enough people working in it? And, you know, I honestly don't know. I mean, certainly there's a huge amount going on in terms of improving new technologies to develop antibiotics quickly, for example. You know, I think in order to answer that question, you need to look closely at the area, the specific area that you would go into, whose lab you would work in, things like that, and just, you know, look at the details of how much impact you would make. I don't think there's a simple answer.
Thank you. And how do you see the relationship between your work and transhumanism?
I actually don't see much link between my work and transhumanism. I don't like to be called a transhumanist. It's crazy, really, because, of course, I do very much approve of the work that people do who call themselves transhumanists, whether it's AGI, whether it's nanotech, you know, I mean, molecular manufacturing, things like that. But I believe that the word transhumanism is a huge albatross. I think that it makes the general public think that we're all out to create a whole new species rather than simply what we ought to be doing, which is emphasizing the continuity of what we're trying to do with the technological advances that have happened in the past and that people are generally happy with.
Thank you. One of the questions you already answered, there's like 1.5 minutes left before the next talk begins. So if you have a burning thing, run up here and you can ask. There you go.
Aubrey, how much money we need to defeat aging?
Great question.
Estimate.
So the thing is, you can't answer that question instantly because the amount of money that one needs at the early stages to develop the beginning of these technologies is much less than what you need at the late stages, but the ease with which that money can be obtained is very different. So once things have got into, as far as clinical trials, then investment money pours in because most of the de-risking has actually already happened. So when I get asked that question, if I want a headline answer, I say tiny amounts. I say like $500 million over a period of 10 years would be totally enough. In fact, now it's probably down to about $250 million. So it's definitely still an order of magnitude more than what we have at SENS Research Foundation. We still only have a budget of about $5 million per year. But it's a pitifully small amount of money as compared to the kind that's spent in medical research generally.
Thank you. That was a good wrap up as our assistant flashed the end sign because it's time for the next things. Thank you so much, Dr. de Grey.
Well, thank you.